Throughout the centuries, humanity has invented increasingly sophisticated ways to inflict pain. Some tortures were so cruel and terrifying that even today, just the description of them sends chills down your spine. In this video, we will dive into the darkest side of the past, where screams of pain were a common occurrence, and suffering was an art. There is a so-called pain frequency severity duration scale, which measures pain on a scale from 0 to 140. The Brazen Bull. At first glance, it seems like just a bronze statue of a bull. Beautiful, polished, almost a work of art. But few would guess that inside this metallic beast hides one of the most brutal execution devices in human history. The statue was made of entirely bronze or copper. Often it was crafted to the life-size proportions of an actual bull. Inside there was a hollow chamber. A person was placed inside, and the door was locked. A fire was then lit beneath the bull. The metal gradually heated up, turning the inside of the statue into a massive furnace. The victim was slowly roasted alive in the cramped space, unable to move or scream for help. But the most horrifying part was how the pipes in the bull's head were arranged. The person's screams would pass through a special system of tubes and emerge outside as a low, distorted roar, as if the bull itself was bellowing in pain. Historians attribute the invention of the brazen bull to the ancient Greek engineer Perillus. He presented this marvel of engineering to the tyrant Phalaris. However, the cruel ruler, impressed by the invention, immediately ordered it to be tested on Perillus himself. Executions in the brazen bull were often carried out publicly. The crowd would watch as the roar emanated from the statue's mouth, and smoke poured from its nostrils, as if it were a real demon. Thus, the brazen bull became not just an instrument of death, but a symbol of perverse cruelty, when pain became a spectacle and death became a performance. Since death in this case came relatively quickly, the pain of this torture is rated 115 out of 140 on the scale. Lun Fin. Ancient China, like many other civilizations, had its own cruel forms of punishment designed to instill fear in the people and maintain order. One of the most infamous and terrifying punishments was a torture known as Lun Fin, or sawing a person in half. Sawing was an extreme measure of punishment and was not applied to everyone. It was reserved for the most heinous criminals, such as traitors, murderers, or rebels. A special saw was used for the execution, which was long, and its blade was often kept in plain sight. Executions were carried out publicly and were meant to serve as a lesson to the entire community. The victim of sawing was usually tied or fixed in a vertical position. The process began by sawing through the most vulnerable areas of the body, which made the execution as painful as possible. However, it's important to understand that sawing often happens slowly in order to create maximum psychological impact on the onlookers. The executioners had to be skilled with their tools, so as not to kill the victim too quickly. Unlike quick executions, this process was intended not only for physical destruction, but also to demonstrate the emperor's power. It was a symbol that crime would not go unpunished. In Chinese culture, the body was considered sacred, and dismembering the body was seen as an act of desecration. This deprived the person of the chance for reincarnation after death. As in Buddhism and Taoism, it was believed that the goal of life was to achieve harmony, and a divided body disrupted that goal. This torture is rated 135 out of 140 on the scale. Garrote. The garrote was a method used to carry out executions in Spain and other European countries. Visually, it resembled a device with a wooden or metal post, on which the condemned person would either sit or stand. The victim would be seated on a chair or tied to a post, with a metal collar placed around the neck. This collar would be tightened from the back using a screw or lever, slowly breaking the neck vertebrae or causing suffocation. The executioner played a key role in the garrote execution process. Throughout the procedure, he could control how tightly the rope or cord would compress. In some cases, to accelerate death, the executioner could tighten the cord sharply, but most often the process was rather slow. Unlike a quick hanging, the garrote could prolong the victim's suffering for tens of minutes. The cause of death was asphyxiation, where blood could no longer flow to the brain, depriving it of oxygen. Additionally, the neck compression could cause damage to the cartilage, spine, and nerves, leading to further suffering. In the 19th century, the device was modernized in Spain, adding a spike that, at the executioner's discretion, could instantly pierce the victim's spine with a single movement. It's hard to believe, but this method of execution wasn't abolished in Spain until 1974. On the scale, this torture scores 95 points. Hanging. One of the most well-known methods of execution in human history is hanging. This method was widely practiced across different cultures and time periods, from ancient times to the modern era. There are several variations of hanging. Drop hanging, where the condemned person was raised several meters into the air and then suddenly dropped, causing the rope to tighten around the neck, usually breaking the vertebrae and ensuring a quick death. Short drop hanging, where the condemned person simply hung by the neck, leading to slow asphyxiation. This method was often used for torture. Hanging was not always an instantaneous death. It was often used as a public punishment, meant to demonstrate the cruelty of the authorities. Crowds of spectators would watch as the condemned suffered in their final moments. In some cases, it was even part of political propaganda. Hangings were often not solitary. They could be group executions. At times, as many as 10 people could be executed simultaneously, with special setups for the purpose. In some cultures, the hanging noose had a particular name, the death cord. The noose was often tied in such a way as to prevent a quick end. This method was most popular in Britain, where hanging as a form of execution was abolished only in 1965. On the scale, this method scores 65 points, as the victim almost did not suffer, except in cases of slow suffocation. Guillotine. The guillotine is perhaps one of the most famous methods of execution, often referenced in cinema and literature. It became a symbol of the French Revolution and was widely used in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. The guillotine consisted of a wooden frame with a slanted platform and a large blade, which was operated by a mechanical system. The condemned person would stand on a special platform. Their neck would be secured in an iron frame, and then the executioner would raise the blade. The guillotine blade typically weighed between 6 and 7 kilograms and was about 30 centimeters long. It was finely sharpened to cut through the tissues and bones of the head with maximum speed and precision. The blade would fall vertically, guided by spikes, allowing it to drop with great force. It would literally fall from several meters in height, slicing through the neck and severing the head. When the blade fell, it would decapitate the condemned person almost instantly. This made the process of execution quick and efficient. Death came immediately, without the suffering of asphyxiation or pain, as seen with other methods like hanging. This method is rated 50 points on the scale. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Damnatio ad bestias, which translates from Latin as condemnation to the beasts, was a public execution method in ancient Rome, where a person was thrown to wild animals, most commonly lions, tigers, or bears, to be torn apart. In most cases, the condemned person was tied to a tree, a post, or simply left in an enclosed arena, often wounded or tortured beforehand, sometimes painted or smeared with blood and fat to attract the animals, occasionally given a wooden weapon as an illusion of survival. The animals were provoked by specially trained trainers. Sometimes the predators were starved for several days before the execution to make them more aggressive. Prisoners were fully aware of their fate in advance. This caused extreme panic and horror. There were cases where the victim would go mad even before the execution began and even commit suicide. This method of execution was invented in ancient Rome and was often carried out in the country's main amphitheater, the Colosseum. The executions were often performed in front of thousands of spectators who would applaud, laugh, or even place bets on the outcome. In Roman society, this was considered a legitimate and even just form of retribution. On the pain scale, this torture is rated 120 out of 140. Breaking on the wheel. One of the most brutal and agonizing executions of the medieval period was breaking on the wheel, also known as wheel torture or wheel execution. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, sometimes horizontally, sometimes vertically like on a cross. The executioner would take a heavy iron mallet or club and methodically begin to break the victim's bones, arms, legs, ribs, all in sequence. At times, the blows would target not the joints, but the spaces between them, causing the bones to break without piercing the skin. The victim remained conscious, feeling their bodies slowly transform into a mass of broken, excruciating pain. After breaking the limbs, the body was woven between the spokes of the large wheel. The limbs were twisted unnaturally, and the victim would hang in the air, fastened to the rotating structure. The wheel would be raised on a pole, and the victim would be left to die in full view of onlookers. Another more grotesque method of execution with the wheel was crucifixion on the wheel. The wheel was set up vertically, and the victim would be nailed or tied to it, sometimes even burned alive while on the wheel. The rarest method involved rolling the wheel with the bound person. The person would be fastened to the wheel, but not horizontally as in the classic method, but on top or inside of the wheel. The wheel would then be rolled across the cobblestones, either by executioners or with the help of horses. During this process, the body would hit the stones with tremendous force, causing fractures, head trauma, and open wounds. On the pain scale, this execution method reaches 130 points. Spanish boot. Once again, we find ourselves in Spain, where the ingenuity of torture methods never ceases to astonish. At first glance, the Spanish boot appears to be a simple pair of metal or wooden casings that tightly squeezed the victim's legs from the feet to the knees. However, the real horror began afterward. There were several variations of the Spanish boot. 1. Wooden boot. 2 tightly pressed wooden boards with a cavity for the foot. Wedges were inserted between the boards, and then they were hammered in slowly. This caused the shin bones to shatter, cracks in the bones, muscle compression, and damage to the blood vessels. 2. Iron boot. A cast metal structure into which the foot was tightly inserted. Sometimes molten oil, boiling water, or the metal itself would be heated. When heated, the skin would stick to the walls of the boot, and the bones would literally cook inside the body. 3. Scottish version, the boot. In Scotland, the boot was made of metal strips, fastened together with rivets. Wedges of wood or metal were driven inside, increasing the pressure. This version also inflicted severe pain and damage, often leading to the eventual loss of limbs. The Spanish boot was considered effective for extracting confessions without immediately killing the victim. Even if the victim survived, they were often left with amputated limbs. On the PFSD scale, this torture method scores 80 out of 140. Scaphism. Imagine a death stretched over days, filled with decay, bites, and madness. This is scaphism, one of the most refined forms of execution in ancient Persia. The victim was stripped naked and placed inside hollowed-out logs or boats, with only their head, arms, and legs left exposed. Then the real torment began. The body was generously smeared with honey and milk, attracting insects. The condemned person was left under the sun, in a swamp or on water. Insects, flies, hornets, mosquitoes, would begin to devour the flesh. First from the outside, then from the inside. Unable to move, the victim would suffer from heat, thirst, open wounds, diarrhea, and infections. Death could take 7, 10, or even 14 days to arrive. Throughout this time, the person remained alive, feeling every moment of their body rotting away. One of the most horrific aspects of scaphism was the incredibly slow death. The victim could suffer from the pain and stench of their own excrement, as well as from aggressive insects and infections. Scaphism was widely used in ancient Persia as a punishment for those who committed grave crimes. On the Pain Frequency Severity Duration Scale, PFSD, this torture method scores the maximum 140 out of 140. Tongue cutting. The tongue-cutting torture involved varying methods, where the tongue was either completely or partially severed. Sometimes only the tip or the root of the tongue was cut, leading to significant bleeding, inflammation, and infection. The victim was often restrained or immobilized to prevent movement, as the torture was extremely painful. Tongue cutting was sometimes accompanied by additional forms of torture, such as the extraction of teeth, further intensifying the victim's suffering. Sharp knives, scissors, or even specialized pincers were used for the execution of this torture. In more severe cases, heated tools might be used. In ancient Rome and other cultures, cutting off the tongue was often a punishment for slander or false accusations. In addition to the excruciating pain and bleeding, the severed tongue led to severe inflammation, which could result in infection and sepsis. The inability to speak had a profound impact on the victim's life, drastically limiting communication. People who feared being deprived of their ability to speak might have been more inclined to self-censorship, contributing to a climate of fear and silence. This torture method scores 45 on the Pain Frequency Severity Duration Scale, PFSD, as it was primarily used as a punishment and rarely led to death. Live entombment, a slow and agonizing death. Live entombment, also known as walling in, was a form of punishment or execution in which a person was sealed inside a confined space, such as a wall or a small room, with no way to escape. Once trapped, the victim would die from suffocation, starvation, or dehydration. This method was widely practiced in ancient times, especially in ancient Rome and Greece, as a severe punishment for criminals and political enemies. During the Middle Ages, it was commonly used to punish women and religious figures accused of immorality or heresy. Beyond the physical suffering, live entombment inflicted immense psychological torment. The awareness of inevitable death in complete isolation caused overwhelming terror and despair. If the space was completely sealed, death would occur within hours due to suffocation. In some cases, a small air hole was left, prolonging the victim's suffering for several days without food or water. This method was one of the most excruciating forms of execution, as it combined slow physical deterioration with severe psychological torture. Historical examples: Ancient Egypt. In some cases, the servants and concubines of pharaohs were entombed alive alongside their deceased ruler. Ancient Rome. Vestal virgins, priestesses of Vesta, who broke their vow of chastity, were buried alive in underground chambers with only a piece of bread and water. China and India. Criminals were sometimes sealed within palace or temple walls, occasionally as ritual sacrifices. Medieval Europe, used by the Inquisition and feudal lords to execute traitors, heretics, and nuns who violated their vows. 60 out of 140. A method of execution that inflicted long-lasting physical agony and intense psychological distress. Sleep deprivation. Deliberate sleep deprivation has been used for centuries as a form of torture and an interrogation technique. As a method of questioning, it has been widely employed by the British, American, and Irish armies, in East Africa during apartheid, and in Japanese prisoner of war (POW) camps. References to this method can also be found in accounts of witch hunts in Scotland. The essence of the technique lies in preventing a person from sleeping through various means, such as forcing them into uncomfortable positions, exposing them to loud noises, bright lights, or other disturbing stimuli. Severe or extreme sleep deprivation can lead to hallucinations, psychosis, and schizophrenia, making it one of the most terrifying psychological and physical tortures. However, its effectiveness as an interrogation method is questionable, as one of the first symptoms of sleep deprivation beyond 24 hours is memory confusion and distorted perception of reality. This form of torture scales 70 points on the Pain Frequency Severity Duration (FSD) scale. Swedish drink, a brutal form of torture. The Swedish drink was a cruel method of torture that involved forcibly filling the victim's stomach with excessive amounts of liquid, leading to excruciating pain, vomiting, ruptured internal organs, and even death. This technique was used in Sweden during the 17th century, particularly during the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, mainly against peasants and enemy soldiers. Method of torture. The victim was force-fed liquid, which could be water, urine, liquid filth, or even excrement. A funnel or tube was sometimes inserted into the throat to facilitate the process. The stomach expanded to a critical point, causing intense pain, bloating, and the potential rupture of internal organs. Some victims died from stomach rupture or suffocation if liquid entered the lungs. Historical use. Despite its name, this torture was not exclusive to Sweden and was practiced in other countries. France, 18th century, used occasionally against prisoners. Nazi Germany, 20th century. Reports suggest that similar methods were used in concentration camps. Final score, 87 out of 140. A highly painful and humiliating method of torture that inflicted both physical agony and psychological horror. Execution by elephant. In India, elephants were used not only in war, but also for public executions. The condemned was brought to the square, where a trained elephant carried out the executioner's orders. Quick death. At the command of the ruler, the elephant would trample the head or chest, instantly killing the victim. Slow execution. The elephant could gradually break the victim's limbs, playing with them before delivering the fatal blow. Some elephants were trained to throw a person into the air, trample on him, or even tear the body, stepping on different parts of the body in turn. This method of execution was used by the Mughals, the Gupta dynasty, the Delhi Sultanate, as well as in Burma and Thailand. Elephants were considered the ideal instrument of justice, since they could either punish or spare. If the ruler changed his mind, the elephant stopped attacking. This sophisticated and unusual method of execution scores 95 points on the scale. Judas cradle. The Judas cradle was a particularly painful and humiliating form of torture. The victim was forced to sit on a pyramid-shaped seat, with the tip pointing directly at the anus or genital area. The person was then strapped to the device, often with their hands and feet tied to prevent movement. As the victim sat on the pyramid, their own weight would cause them to be slowly impaled. Over time, this would cause severe internal injuries, including damage to internal organs and blood vessels. The victim would experience excruciating pain as the tip of the pyramid slowly tore through sensitive tissue, causing extreme physical suffering. The victim could either die from physical injury or suffer prolonged agony, as the torture could last for hours, days, or even longer if the torturer chose to prolong it. This device was used during the Inquisition and medieval Europe to extract confessions, punish criminals, and humiliate people. It was usually used on heretics, blasphemers, or those accused of witchcraft. The Judas cradle was a method designed to break both the body and the spirit, causing extreme physical pain, while simultaneously forcing the victim into a state of complete vulnerability and helplessness. 100 out of 140 on the pain scale. Yubitsume is the practice of cutting off a finger phalanx in the Japanese Yakuza. This ritual serves as a punishment for misdeeds, or as a way to atone for guilt before the boss or group. A person must cut off the outer phalanx of his little finger himself. A traditional sharp tanto knife is used for the ritual. The cut-off piece of the finger is wrapped in cloth or paper and given to the boss as a sign of repentance. If a person continues to make mistakes, he cuts off the next phalanges or other fingers. This method of torture is not only physically difficult, but also mentally. After all, the victim must cause pain to himself. The reason why it is the little finger that is cut off is historical. In the old days, the samurai's main weapon was always a sword, and without the little finger, the sword cannot be held tightly, because the grip of the little finger is the strongest on the handle. On the pain scale, this torture corresponds to 110 out of 140 points. Rat torture. One of the most ancient methods of torture. The first confirmed cases were in the 1st century in the Roman Empire. In Rome, they used rat plagues to torture prisoners, leaving them in locked cellars with hundreds of hungry rodents who ate them alive. In ancient China, there was an execution in which the victim was tied up and became completely immobilized, and rats were locked in an iron vessel placed on the victim's stomach or chest. Then a fire was lit under the vessel, and the rats, maddened by the heat, gnawed their way through the person's flesh. In Europe, particularly in France and England in the Middle Ages, people were dressed in large puffy pants, made of thick material, into which rats were released. Due to the lack of air, they tried to get out, but it was impossible for them to gnaw through the material. They began to eat human flesh. If you think that this torture ceased to exist in the Middle Ages, you are mistaken. In South American countries, as early as the 20th century, during military dictatorships, rats were used as an instrument of psychological and physical violence. They were stuffed into metal pipes and forced to penetrate the bodies of the victims. It was also common practice to put a metal cage over a person's face and release rodents into it. This method was considered one of the most excruciating, as it combined physical pain, psychological horror, and slow death. This type of torture on the scale scores almost a maximum of 135 out of 140, since the victim understands during torture that he has practically no chance of survival. Bamboo torture is one of the most brutal and creative torture methods used in ancient China and other parts of Asia. The victim was tied to the ground or laid on the ground, and young bamboo shoots were placed on their body, usually on the stomach or chest. Since bamboo grows incredibly quickly, up to 10 centimeters per day, its shoots gradually penetrated the victim's body, piercing it until the bamboo reached the internal organs. The bamboo's growth could be so rapid that it caused severe pain, internal injuries, and eventually death due to organ damage or infection. Since the process took several days, the victim died slowly and painfully, making the torture even more horrific. This method was extremely effective because it left no visible marks or wounds, making it virtually undetectable to onlookers, while still causing excruciating pain and suffering. Some victims died simply from shock during the first hours of bamboo growth. This sophisticated torture scores 137 points on the scale.